hello everyone for this special exercise of applied schizophrenia, if I may say so. So the title of my paper is Archaeological Arguments for the Psychedelic Cure of Western Philosophy. Basically what I want to point at, or basically the thesis, is that Western philosophy was stuck in a substantial ontology, in an ontology of substance, and hence in some aporias. Because it refused facts that did not or that do not belong to the normal state of consciousness, which means that do not belong to what is prehended in sense perception, or more precisely exteroception, meaning the senses that are directed toward the external world, and even more precisely sight. I'll remind that in a moment, but vision has been considered as the most aristocratic perception. Hearing, touch, smell, and so forth have been considered as too mundane, or more precisely, not objective enough. So what I want to do simply is to follow the handout that you might have in front of you. So a short introduction dealing with the issue of what is or what should be or could be a philosophy of psychedelics. First, second, pointing at these prejudices, the substantial prejudices of the philosophy of mind, and then looking uphill at what happened to that logos. Well, if you look at the origin of philosophy and contrast mythos with logos, the mythological understanding of the world and the logical understanding of the world, then you have some clues with regard to the origin, the relevance, but also the applicability of substantialism. And then if we look at the other end, instead of uphill but downhill, and have a look at what happens with process thought, you see that there is a shift, or a shift is encouraged from logos to sumbebekos. Sumbebekos means the accident. I was looking for a word to express the idea of event in Greek, since I'm dealing with Greek stuff here. And so what matters here, of course, is, not of course, but what matters is to look at one's own experience and how far one can generalize from that experience. So one of the main issue of my talk is radical empiricism. So, but maybe I'll give you a short introduction, if you don't mind, coming from a book I won't, I'll tell you later what it is. Anyway, so here it comes. To the future or to the past, to a time when thought is free, when men are different from one another and do not live alone, to a time when truth exists and what is done cannot be undone. From the age of uniformity, from the age of solitude, from the age of COVID-19, from the age of doublethink, greetings. This is Orwell, unthinkable Orwell. Anyway, so back to our tracks. Let's start with a short introduction. So the first point is to define what is a philosophy of psychedelics, or what could be, what should be a philosophy of psychedelics. It's obviously a part of the philosophy of mind, but it will relativize the respectable philosophical categories of the philosophy of mind. What is mind? What is matter? Why dualism? Why consciousness? And how does it work? Well, by definition, philosophy of psychedelics will address altered states of consciousness that are induced by, let's say, the metabolization of plants or drugs. I'm saying metabolization because talking about intoxication would be already too specific. But here, it's important to define, to make the difference, a clear difference between a drug and a medicine, or a plant, if you like. A drug comes out of a factory. A drug makes you dependent, and a drug is toxic for your body, for your mind, for your soul, if you have use of that concept. A medicine, on the other hand, a plant or whatever stuff comes out of, or a cactus, if you like, it's different, is natural. It's not coming out of a factory. So it has evolved with us and with our brain, by the way. It leads you towards autonomy, no dependence, but autonomy. And it's healthy. It's healthy for your body, it's healthy for your mind, it's healthy for your soul. Of course, you need the proper context, of course, but that's the idea. So philosophy of psychedelics deals with these altered states of consciousness induced by the use of drugs and medicines. And the interest, of course, is that if you take into account that sort of experiences, then you bring a broader picture to the fore, and you can relativize all these what I call respectable philosophical categories. You can question again what is mind, what is matter, what is dualism, what is consciousness. First thing, and second thing, you can question anew what does it mean to, what a therapy means for one individual. How can you bring new states of consciousness? How can you bring new moods? How can you help people going through difficult experiences or traumatic events on the one hand, and on the other hand, how does that personal journey impact a community or a society? So that's for the philosophy of psychedelic issue itself. Now, the abstract has insisted, and still insists, of course, on the double issue of facts and logic. This is very central for philosophy. It's quite simple to sort it out. What are the facts that are suitable for philosophy? Do you define these facts a priori? Which basically means that you are screening what is of interest to you? Or do you accept everything that comes out of your experience and then only later, a posteriori, define, tiens, this is of real interest to me. Tiens, this morning I've seen a pink elephant in my bathroom. It is doubtful that it has a philosophical relevance, but nevertheless, I write it down and see if I can correlate that fact with something else. There is no reason why the pink elephant should be refused, a priori. So, what are the facts suitable for philosophy? It's really the question that is addressed by radical empiricism. Radical empiricism means, following clearly James and Whitehead to some extent, implicitly, let's say, Whitehead, let's accept all experiences. Let's deal with experiences only. Let us not worry about something that cannot be experienced. So, that's what with regard to facts. But now logic, what is the logic acceptable for modeling? Again, do we define our logical categories a priori, independently of what is experienced? Or do we extract these categories from what is being experienced? This is the old Kantian issue, for instance. Are our logical categories innate or not? If you look at the most recent history of thought, especially after Spencer, his Principle of Psychology, 1855, if I remember correctly, but it's just the time of Darwin, of course, and the idea that our psychology has also evolved. If you consider the work of Spencer, but also Piaget or Bateson, what you see, what you can understand is that there is a development not only for one given individual of his or her own categories. If you question a very young child or a young adult or an old adult, you'll get different categories at work, different ways of understanding reality, different ways of cutting out the experience. This is called ontogenesism, enfin, whatever. And then, of course, you can understand that the evolution of a given individual from the perspective of his phylum or her phylum. Phylum, it means the part of evolution that is yours. Our central nervous system is quite similar to the one of monkeys, for instance. But if you look at how other animals work, it's a different issue. So we have, all categories are linked with that evolution, of course, as well, sorry. And the third point is the one of Betson that can be called koinogenesis. And it means that culture brings us, fosters different ways of cutting out reality. So these logical categories, these different ways of systematizing a worldview have a history. And it used to be that philosophy never thought about that. And then I'd say since the late 19th century, if you're interested in that issue, you can read Čapek, for instance. He's especially, I'd say, he used to be good. I mean, now he's completely dead, of course, but I mean, his work used to be good. Sorry about the... Bon, donc, facts, let's bring all facts into the picture. Logic, let us consider that logic, the logical categories we use and the model we frame have a history. And so the entire trick, of course, is to start from your own experience and try to generalize it. This is explicitly what Whitehead is claiming one should do. And voilà, let's say that I've dealt with facts and logic. So the third point, I've inverted the two and three in the introduction. I suppose nobody will blame me really. And the third point is simply to remind everyone that James and Whitehead are especially relevant for that sort of exercise. Radical empiricism was explicitly claimed and practiced by James, especially from a psychedelic perspective, whereas Whitehead was simply open to the issue, but remained most of his life teetotal, if I remember correctly. And so what is fascinating is that both James Whitehead, but also, let's say, Bergson or Peirce, they aim at the same worldview, they share the same vision, but they do it from completely different perspective. And what Whitehead does not get from direct experience, like James would, for instance, he gets it from his imaginative generalizations. Okay, so now let's have a look at the first main point. That is the title being Philosophy of Mind, Substantial Prejudices. Okay, so here again, we have two main routes. The first route is, how do we define the facts? Well, facts in, as I said earlier, facts in Western philosophy have been defined by sense perception, but exteroception, which means perception of the external world, and more precisely by vision. Taste, smell, touch, hearing have been considered as lower senses. The interest of vision, Hans Jonas is very good with that regard, but he was probably inspired by Whitehead, by the way. Whitehead says it someplace. Anyway, the specificity of vision is that it puts the subject in the situation of the spectator of a theater. You stand possibly in an impassionate way in front of a spectacle that is unfolding there in front of you, you see? And you can identify sort of time, causality, and so forth and so on in a purely objective way. And you can measure things. The picture would be completely different if you were to close your eyes and simply hear the scene if you're at the theater. And of course, if you have to rely upon touch, then it makes you a completely different kind of subject. A subject that would be, by the way, that would be closer to Whitehead's ontology, insofar as insofar as contiguity is very important when you deal with his ontology. I won't talk about that really. The main point is facts are defined by common sense, the sense that are the sense that is or that are common to all of us. What I see, you can see. What I touch, you can touch. And so what is envisioned can be double checked with others on the one hand, but also with animals. If you have a dog, for instance, you will see that the dog is aiming at the same sort of gratification as you are, probably. Well, I don't want to make any assumption, but you see what I mean. Whitehead talks about that, for instance, when he says that after a walk in a rainy day, and so forth and so on, the dog and yourself are both aiming at the same spot close to the fire. So what we call facts are constructed, of course, they are screened by our perception, of course, but they are co-constructed, and that co-construction is made with our fellow human beings, of course. And remember that I said that we construct the world in different ways. If you're dealing with a toddler, that toddler will still deal with the same world as you do, but calling it differently, naming it differently, understanding it differently, but you still can point at the same contraptions. You still can deal with that form of, with what is called the concrete, if you like, different kind of humans, I said it, and animals, of course. Anyway, so that's the first point. The second point is, so what about logic? From where do our categories spring? These categories, the categories that have had an enduring impact on the history of philosophy and that have been relativized by process thought, is basically the Aristotelian logic, which means the important three things: the importance of the principle of identity, the principle of non-contradiction, and the excluded middle. The picture is, again, a purely substantial picture that is directly linked with the way we experience reality in the normal sense of consciousness, in the normal state of consciousness. Sorry. So we could discuss this, but it makes sense that philosophy has been first trying to deal with what is shared in the normal sense of consciousness, in the normal state of consciousness. And this makes all the more sense that philosophy initially was a political venture, or is directly correlated with some form, I'll see it in a second, with some form of political transformation. And here, that's why I'm talking about the politics of mind, because if you have a look at the interesting paper or argument proposed by Appel, Carl Otto Appel, in the 50s or rather 70s, I don't know, I should check it. He points at the fact that logic actually presupposes an ethics of communication. It means that the root of the principle of non-contradiction is something that belongs to the ethics of communication, something that basically belongs to what Socrates is saying in the Gorgias. Socrates is saying that there would not be something worse than contradicting myself. You can find that in Arendt. Arendt in The Life of Mind points at the fact that according to her, there are only two positive utterings of Socrates in the Platonic corpus. And these two utterings are directly linked with that urge not to contradict oneself, with the urge to be at peace with oneself. And from that peaceful perspective, to be able to deal with whatever happens, and especially to deal with our fellow human beings. So, hence the transition. So I said that the uphill, or that the origin of philosophy has to be found in mythology. It's something that is very well known, that has been studied. Whitehead himself, when he was dealing with the works of Cornford and other English scholars of the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, Whitehead is fully aware of that, of course. So here, what I simply want to do is to point us at three very simple facts. When you have to build a worldview, you have to start from a standpoint. What is the standpoint that you start from? Where do you speak, if you like? Before philosophy, at the time when mythology was defining the worldview, if you like, the central point was the palace, was the place of the king. And the place of the palace of the king has been replaced when philosophy occurred by the agora, by the marketplace. So it means that you have this is the sign of a political disruption that eventually led to democracy. So the palace has been replaced by the agora. And how do you link people? How do you link? How do you make out history for a community? At the time of mythology, it was through a genealogy of gods, sexual intercourse between gods, bringing forth events or moods of the gods, or more or less anthropocentric understandings. And this has been replaced by arguments, causality, something that is straightforward, if you like, as you say in English. And the third point, with regard to the link, the synchronic link between individuals, is to replace ritual by debate. So the emergence of philosophy is made out, very roughly, three main points that can be pictured like a cross, if you like. You have the central point that has been displaced from the palace to the agora. You have the vertical dimension that deals with the origin of things, if you like. It's the genealogy that is replaced by an argument. It's the issue of the arché, of the principle that rules things. And then the third point is how do you link pairs between themselves, individuals between themselves at the same time, at the same moment, sorry. Ritual has been replaced by debate. So that's the context of the emergence of philosophy. Now, let's have a look at what happens when we introduce process thought. And it's interesting to see, but I won't look at this right now, but maybe you'll find the hints. It's interesting to see that process thought, to some extent, or Whitehead especially, to some extent, goes back to a Renaissance point of view, which means first that the agora, the marketplace, that used to define the central point, the place from which one speaks, which was communitarian, is now an individual. Remember the Vitruve man, when you see that man spread out in a circle, basically pointing at the fact that the microcosm is like the macrocosm, macrocosm. This is what Whitehead would call the reformed subjectivist principle. It's impossible. You cannot avoid to start from your own experience. One will not start from what happens in the marketplace, what happens in dialogue. It's a reformed subjectivist principle that he brings forth, and that is inspired in part by Descartes. But of course, he goes beyond Descartes insofar as the idea is to start from your own experience, but to expand it in order to take into account all possible experiences. So the first point is the reformed subjectivist principle. The second point is the replacement of an argument in the old-fashioned way by the most likely story. That's what he calls imaginative generalization. And so what matters here, it seems to me, is that what we are looking for is not simply a purely consistent framework. It's in the first page. That discussion is in the first 2 pages of Process and Reality, but a coherent framework. And that coherence is broader than pure, that's simply following the law of non-contradiction. And it brings with it the possibility of using symbols, again, like it used to be, like it has been used at the time of Renaissance. And the third point is the substitution of debate by radical experience. One should not talk about pure abstractions, but one should start any discussion from actual facts, facts that have been experienced, but facts that are, of course, screened by what he calls imaginative generalization, but which means facts that are deprived of their purely subjective dimension, and that can be expanded to all possible experiences. So, so the conclusion, I suppose it's about time to conclude. The conclusion is simply that one needs to reconsider the basis of Western philosophy, something that does not happen in other systems. In India, for instance, they won't bother, they won't worry about tetralemma, for instance. They won't worry about the principle of non-contradiction itself. It does not mean that they don't acknowledge that the principle of non-contradiction is important to deal with things in everyday life. It does not mean that they don't want to avoid contradiction, especially from a moral perspective. It simply means that when you try to consider, when you try to build a coherent worldview, you have to go beyond these limitations that have been framed because of our limited experience, lack of intuition, etc., etc. You know the passage that I'm referring to in Process and Reality. So the key issue is facts. How do we define these facts? Do we accept all possible facts, all possible experiences, and accept them as facts on the one hand? And then what do we do with them from a logical perspective, if you like? How do we extract a model out of these experiences? Well, I suppose I've said more or less what I wanted to say. I won't accept any questions. I'm not in the mood. And otherwise, well, it would have been a pleasure to meet you in person.